My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute. This is a recording of a lecture from my Frank Lloyd Wright course on Fallingwater. It was given in the spring of 2014, and the lecture is followed by a video that I showed that won't be seen here on repairing the structural problems with the building. Okay, Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater. Frank Lloyd Wright's career had lots of ups and downs. And, there are several periods. There are long periods where he had little or no work. And in part, it's because he lived to be 91 years old, so there was plenty of time for that. In the 1930s, he decided to open what he called an apprenticeship at Taliesin, and young people could come and study architecture there. And which is a difficult decision for a young person to make. What's your parents going to say? I want to go study architecture with Frank Lloyd Wright. He's a nut. You're never going to get a job. You got to go to school and get a degree. What if you told your parents, oh, I'm going to spend 2 years with Calatrava? You know that'd be really cool. But you're going to get a degree? Can you get student loans? How do you, is it recognized through the registration exam? So, but anyway, one of the students doing this was Edgar Kaufman Jr., and his parents his father owned the department store in Pittsburgh, main department store, and the family had land outside of Pittsburgh in Mill Run, and there was a rock on a waterfall where they picnicked. And it was time to build a weekend house. So Kaufman Jr. says, hey, Dad, why don't we get Frank Lloyd Wright to do it? So they did. And it was way over budget and involved lots of difficulties, but probably was worth it in that, their weekend house ended up on the cover of Time magazine. So this relaunched Frank Lloyd Wright's career. At this time, mid-30s, 35, 36, he does 2 buildings, Fallingwater and Johnson Wax headquarters that we'll see next week. And it's like, people didn't even know he was alive anymore. Hadn't done anything in 10 years, had no work. He was at, wasn't that guy who did something at the turn of the century? He did something in the 1900s. This is the modern era. Is he still around? So suddenly he comes roaring back. 1941, Museum of Modern Art in New York gives him a major one-man show at the whole museum. So he's relaunched into a high degree of prominence. So we're in this wooded area. Anybody been there? Pratt, pretty much every year, Pratt has a trip. So I strongly recommend it. It's affordable because you go all night in a bus and that kind of thing, real student stuff. But you can't just stop by. You have to get tickets in advance because it's really well booked. But we're in the middle of woods. Here is Fallingwater right here. Here's a walkway up to the guest house we're not going to look at. And then this is kind of an X-shaped visitor's place, and then here's the parking. So you park here, go to the visitor center, and then you traipse up here for your tour of the house. So it was given to a conservancy by the Kaufmans, and it has long been not used as a residence, but as a museum. We all know these views. So the site is going up this way. Waterfall comes down, and it was Wright's idea to build it over the water. Now you can't see the waterfall from the house because it's built over it. Although from here you can walk down. There's a staircase and you're right over the waterfall. And this is the main living room. Bedrooms up here with a balcony, and then another bedroom up here. And then cantilevered balcony here and kitchen areas back here. Now, it's very much laid out as a weekend house. In other words, one major space where everybody hangs out. There's no formal dining room. You don't entertain there. It's just where you just go for the weekend. And You go up to your bedrooms, and then otherwise you hang out in this great space. You drive in this way, entrance in the back to the house or to the kitchen, bring in supplies, and then the site continues to go up. So here's the sloping site, and we're sort of wedged into the site and then open up outwards to the view. We're going to look in a few minutes at how the structure works. But there's a very strong communication between inside and outside, so he uses this flagstone for the flooring, same inside and outside. So that there's and then we have floor-to-ceiling glass here, so this flow from inside to outside. Same thing over here, and then here it's really weird because you go down this stair and you're over the window. Where did I go outside? You're inside and then you're standing over the waterfall. So it's there's this real rich integration of interior and exterior spaces. This is the rock on which the family would picnic, so they still have their rock. And Wright tells us this is built because he varnishes the flagstones, and then this is natural, not varnished. This is for hot mold cider. You can swing it around and heat it up in the fireplace. And then fireplace is over here. This is our expansive interior space, floor-to-ceiling glass so that the space flows from inside to outside, and breaking the box, no mullion in the corner. So, but glass, just two pieces of glass touching with no mullion, because it's the defined corner that makes a box. And then constructed with flagstone from, fieldstone from local quarries. Now, here's one of the bedrooms. You might question having fieldstone as an interior material. Wouldn't you want sheetrock in here? In other words, or plaster. In other words, it's not a friendly material. If you brush your sweater against it, it's going to pill the sweater. And so it kind of feels hostile to human beings. Outside, it's fending off nature, so you want rusticated stone for your exterior wall. So why does he use it on both inside and outside? A, there's a reason why it's okay, and B, it's a reason why he wants to. Right. So the reason why he wants to is there's a continuing flow from inside to outside. So the glass is, you would, for functional reasons, you'd want a mullion here for the glass to meet into. You don't want glass going right into stone. We can do it better than he could because we can have it go into silicon, and the silicon will cushion the stone. Because the house moves just from temperature or whatever, and you're worried that it's going to crack the glass. So ideally today, we don't use painted steel anymore because it rusts, so we would use, don't tell Frank Lloyd Wright, vinyl-covered aluminum with the glass going into neoprene, double pane glass and all that. So much more functional. But Wright wants to show this flow from inside to outside, the continuity, and doesn't want the glass to interrupt it. And the reason why it's okay is that it's a weekend house. You're not going there in formal clothes. You're there to sort of be camping anyway. Those who worked with Frank Lloyd Wright or studied with Frank Lloyd Wright or studied with someone who did are filled with Frank Lloyd Wright stories. There's, all these Frank Lloyd Wright anecdotes. Real famous one is he had very complex roofs, and they would leak a lot. And I don't know if we can blame the architect for that. You tend to blame the contractor for not doing the flashing right. But there's, client in outrage calls Wright. Wright comes over, roof is leaking, there's this big puddle in the living room. He says, what am I supposed to do about that? Wright takes a piece of paper, makes a paper boat, and launches it into the water. But anyway, here's a Frank Lloyd Wright story, told to me by Edgar Taffel, who's right here. So Edgar Taffel was one of the apprentices, then had a important practice in New York City, and he just died a couple of years ago in his 90s. And he did a Franklin Wright tour for Pratt some years ago that I was fortunate to go on, so we saw lots of the work in the Midwest. But he tells a story that Wright visited the site only once, and Edgar Taffel was one of the jog captains on the job, so he knew it pretty well. So Wright visited the site only once, and made no drawings and no models, no sketches. So usually when there's an important work of architecture, you want to go to the archive and get all the preliminary sketches that the architect did, and you can see how the project changed and evolved in the architect's mind before being built. Wright had the whole thing designed in his head. And remember our Froebel blocks, Wright had mastered form on the level of language. In other words, he had the ability to handle form, whereas we might have to make drawings or a model to see what's happening. He could do it in his head. Kaufman was coming to Chicago for business meetings, called Wright up and said, "I'm going to be in Chicago, can I come by and see you?" And Wright says, "Sure." And they worked out a date, and then he gets a call from Taffel. "I'm in Racine, I have 2 days of meetings. It's about a 4-hour drive to Spring Green, Wisconsin, where Taliesin is." And Wright says, "We're waiting." And so then after the 2 days of meetings, he calls Wright in the morning and says, "I'm taking off, and I'll be there in about 4 hours." And Wright says, "We're waiting." At which point, he then whips out the paper. And with the students standing right before mechanical pencils. So the students are just in relays, sharpening pencils with razor blades, feeding them to Wright. He grinds out the structural supports, first floor, second floor, third floor, and started laying out the perspective. Kaufman comes through the door. Wright says, "Edgar, we've been waiting for you. Where you been?" And he's just it was the first time he'd put pencil to paper. And the whole thing was worked out. Now, we associate Wright with Japanese architecture, and there's several relationships here. One, we'll talk about his organic philosophy at the end of the course, but in a crude sense, we can say there are three things: God, man, and nature. So in the biblical tradition, God is first, central, and highest, and then there's man, and then there's nature. So man is above nature and God is above man, because God gave man dominion over nature to name the animals and use them. So in the humanist tradition, man is on top. So we know and can control nature. And every culture has a different God, because God's a function of the human imagination. So there's man and nature and God, but man is foremost and central in humanism. In Japan, in particular, in the East in general, human beings are natural creatures and spirit is in all things. So God, man, and nature is one integrated whole. There aren't three things. There's only one integrated thing. And in a certain sense, that's the best description of what Wright means by organic architecture, but we'll talk about that at the end of the course. Another influence on Wright was Japanese buildings themselves, and we'll talk more about that later. And another one was Japanese prints. So just so that you can know, you're going to, just to tease you guys, so Wright was a dealer in Japanese prints. 1905, he went to Japan, bought a huge cache of prints, and whenever he would go to Japan, like he was doing at Tokyo Hotel, he would buy prints and then he'd sell them, and it was one of the ways he supported himself. He doesn't have the prints because he sold them, but one batch he did give to the Metropolitan Museum, and so you can see that collection at the Met. And some of them are out sometimes with the living room from the Little House at the Metropolitan Museum. But one of the things we see in Japan is we understand space volumetrically. In Japan, space is conceived of as in layers, like maybe the layers of an onion, rather than volumetrically. And so in a Japanese print, you'll almost always see something like this, establishing the first layer in the foreground. And then we've established another layer here, we establish another layer with the mountains. So it's a series of layers. When you look at Katsura Imperial Villa, you see the layers from the Soji screens as you're looking from room to room to room. Some of them will be open, and you'll see these layers. And in a sense, we can see Wright doing that here. This is the favorite spot from which to photograph Fallingwater. So this, like these leaves, establishes our foreground. And then we go back, and then we establish another layer, and then we go back and establish another layer. So here we see this Japanese influence from Japanese prints on Wright's architecture. Now there's something about this view which was always, there was a book came out about 15 years ago on Fallingwater, whole book. And there's a photo on the cover, and one of the things the author says is, this is now the definitive view of Fallingwater. This is about every 10 or 15 years, there's a new photograph, and then that's the one everybody uses. And you can sort of tell when a photograph has been taken in a way, even easier if there are people in it, right? What's the first thing that gives away the date of a photograph if it has people in it? Clothing and hair, right? But even if it's, you know, a nude with close cropped hair, you can tell. There's just a look to 1920s photographs, to 1940s photographs, to 1960s photographs. And the photographer is capturing the thing, whether it's a person they're making a portrait of, or a nude, or Fallingwater, from the point of view of their time. Now, there's a big problem with this picture, though. We crop that out. So for years, for decades, you know, every photograph was a variant of this. Sometimes more nature, sometimes, you know, more dramatic cantilever, get closer and use a wider angle lens, maybe. But today we want to really see it like this. We're going to see why this is very important in a few minutes. So I just want to show you some photographs going through some seasons. One observation. There's no diagonals in the entire building except here. We'll see these in a minute. Even the stairs don't have a diagonal member holding them. Each stair is held by vertical rods. So sort of saying there's no diagonals by having two diagonals so that you can realize there aren't any others. So I didn't, not talking about the guest house. A few years later, this is Fallingwater, up the hill, they had Wright do a guest house. And this is, if you go there, look at this walkway. This is a cover for the walkway. And it's only supported on one side. It's done by a German engineer with these really bizarre cantilevering curve. So it was quite something to work out. Now, interesting little bit of historical interpretation here. If we go to Europe late 1800s, early 1900s, you get the Viennese secessionists, and then you get the early Bauhaus, you get early Walter Gropius. They don't have an aesthetic. They know that they want to reject neoclassicism, no Greek columns, but they're ending up with boxes. In other words, they don't, okay, this is what we're not going to do, but what are we going to do? And so 1911, Frank Lloyd Wright goes to Europe for a year, spends time in Holland with a publisher named Wasmuth, and does what's called the Wasmuth Folio. And it's a presentation of his work. This is a time when there aren't, magazines and the internet, so it would be a real effort to let people know what you're doing, and this did. And so this is one of the photographs in the Wasmuth Folio, the back of the Ward Willett House. And you see this very rectilinear, geometric, interpenetrating planes. And this blows the Europeans away, and the Dutch see it first, and it launches the steel. So the Dutch are then making paintings and sculpture in this vocabulary. This is a Rietveld chair, Rietveld study, and a Rietveld building in this very rectilinear geometric studies that they get from Frank Lloyd Wright. These Dutch de Stijl architects then go and give a lecture at the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus is blown away, and they say, this is the aesthetic we've been looking for. And we now see this rectilinear geometric architecture coming into the European modern vocabulary. So here we see it in Corbeau. And now we have Richard Neutra, Austrian architect, relocates to the United States, to California, and he does the Lobell House. And so this is the late 1920s, and we see the Europeans have taken this Frank Lloyd Wright geometric interpenetrating planes aesthetic to quite developed qualities. And they've added a lot of transparency and lightweight. So these are, it's being supported on these lightweight members, and we have huge areas of glass. That influence then comes back to Frank Lloyd Wright. So we go from Frank Lloyd Wright to the Europeans back to Frank Lloyd Wright. Or that's what the historians were saying. Frank Lloyd Wright's response was, oh yeah? How come I'd already done it in 1909? When those guys were still in kindergarten. So if you look at the Thomas Gale House in Oak Park, where Frank Lloyd Wright lived, every feature we see here is in the Gale House. Here's our anchoring chimney core. Here's our cantilevered main level. Here's our cantilevered second level. Here's the roof coming out over that. Here's our cantilevered element going off to the left. Now this is why this is important that it's be included in the photograph, because it's part of the composition. So I just gave you an interpretation of Wright influencing Europeans and Europeans influencing Wright. Other people say, absolutely not. Wright had already done it in 1909. And not only that, something else is interesting. That there are, I showed you those patterns, right? Like major space, minor space, entrance in between, and it shows up in, I showed you about 4 or 5, it shows up in a dozen buildings. This doesn't show up anywhere else. This is not one of Wright's patterns. He just used it a second time in Fallingwater, only once, to make sure that no one would be able to credit this with any previous influence, credit Fallingwater with any previous influences. Ties it right back to his 1909 Gale House.